Hello, and welcome back to the Going Off Track podcast. I am Kathryn. That was Canada, and quite possibly the race of the year. Let me know what you think in the comments, but I'm pretty sure that was one of the most exciting races we have seen in general in a very long time, and certainly since the top of the season. Now, before we dive into all of the things, don't forget to like and subscribe so I can continue to inflict my motorsport opinions upon the greater population. And if you're listening on your preferred podcast platform, please don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. Now, we do need to talk about some post-race penalties that have been handed down from the race stewards that have been released in the last, I would say, 10 to 15 minutes. It's about 2 hours, 3 hours after the race has ended. And there were a lot of incidents on track that they said that the race stewards were going to discuss after the race. Well, all of those things are coming out now. We have a bunch of 5-second penalties, a 10-second penalty, and a €5,000 suspended fine. I'm sure you can guess what that is for, but let's go into it first. First of all, the 5-second penalties, number one for Nico Hülkenberg for speeding in the pit lane by 0.3 kilometers per hour of the 80 kilometer per hour limit. Valtteri Bottas also got a penalty for speeding in the pit lane by 0.1 kilometers per hour. So that's really how concerned they are about speeding in the pit lane. And Gabriel Bortoleto also got a 5-second penalty, but not for speeding in the pit lane, but for exceeding the virtual safety car delta by driving too slowly. Now, do any of these have an impact on their final placements / anyone the points? No. So do we really need to worry about it? Not at all. And then, of course, the 10-second penalty was Oscar Piastri for hitting Alex Albon, insult to injury for McLaren's nightmare day, which we will dive into all of that in a little bit. And now the most interesting of all of these documents that have been handed down by the FIA post-race is actually the €5,000 suspended fine, which, if you can imagine, that was for George Russell, which if you missed it, then where were you? But when George's car failed in the middle of the race in some really exciting racing, he was naturally very upset, and he threw his headrest off of the car and basically onto the track, not onto the racing line, but onto the track. So there was a pop-up during the race at some point after that about George being under investigation because yeeting things onto the track is not good and is actually kind of dangerous, especially in the case of another car driving over it. Now, like I said, he took the headrest off and it was not on the racing line, but still the FIA came down on him with a €5,000 suspended fine. And in the document, I wanted to read this quote from the decision document, which said, the driver explained that he was extremely frustrated for having failed to finish the race and expressed his embarrassment as what subsequently followed. He apologized to the stewards for his action and acknowledged that it did not set a good example and offered to apologize publicly. So George feels bad about it. George was very emotional. Obviously, that was that. Now, if you also want to see all of these documents are publicly available on the FIA website. I've talked about it a lot. So I talked about it a lot, and then I was like, how did I even get to that web page on the FIA website? Because it's not the easiest to get to, but what you do is you go to FIA.com, and then in the sport tab at the top menu, you go to World Championships, which is kind of in the middle on the left, hit the Formula One World Championship link, which will take you to a page with the initial rendering of the 2026 era F1 car. And if you scroll down a little bit on the right-hand side, it says Canadian Grand Prix official documents. And if you click that link, you will get to the page that has all of the decision documents, all of the infringements, race scrutineering, decisions, the preliminary classification, the finalized classification, which is not yet out for the Canadian Grand Prix, for the record, and also all of the summonses throughout the weekend, and also some really interesting information about what teams are bringing upgrades, the power unit elements, deleted lap times, the power unit information, display procedures. It gives you a lot of really fun information if you want to dive into that. But that's how you get to that page when you're looking through Instagram and they're showing those FIA decision documents on the letterhead. That's where they all come from. So enjoy that, and I will link it down below. And if you bookmark it, it will automatically update for each race, which is how I didn't actually remember how to get to it, and I had to poke around a little bit before I started recording for you. Now, let's dive into what happened on track this weekend that wasn't just penalties, which there were a decent amount of penalties. They were really, I wouldn't say they were throwing them out there, but there were a lot of things that were worthy of penalties. And first things first, was the sprint race actually really good? And if you have been listening to the Going Off Track podcast for any amount of time, you know that our opinions about the sprint races go from a one-off that's exciting, but mostly we don't like it. And we're still there. But if we have to keep enduring the sprints, I think that it's good for F1 to continue giving us different options of tracks for sprints. Because if we're going to have to keep living with it, we might as well figure out which tracks actually give us good sprint races. Like China gave us a good sprint race, and I wouldn't necessarily say this year's was a good race, but last year's was a good race. And even this one, this is the first time Canada has hosted the sprint race, and it was really exciting. Of course, when you get into traffic, that's where things get exciting in such a shortened timeline of a race. So I actually really liked it. And I don't always love the concept of traffic. Obviously, there was a ton of traffic and lapped cars in this Grand Prix race, but the traffic and lapped cars really did give us some added interest and added challenge to the overall sprint race, where I would say we can sprint in Canada again. Are there other tracks that we should not sprint at? Yes. But Canada is a place that we can continue to sprint. And so someone tells Stefano Domenicali that I approve. Or don't. I don't know. Whatever. But anyway, let's break down the Grand Prix podium, which the sprint winner was George, and that was the end of George's good weekend, other than him getting pole. But whatever. Let's talk about the podium for the Grand Prix. That was a really exciting race from start to finish, which we don't always necessarily have exciting races from start to finish. That was a good first half of the race. The middle was mid, and we had some really exciting stuff, but it wasn't in the front end, so it didn't really matter. But this was fun and fights and some of the best wheel-to-wheel action we have seen in a very long time. Of course, leading with the fact that Kimi Antonelli, who had another bad race start, but still managed to finish his race in P1 and is the first F1 driver ever to win his first 4 races consecutively, which is bananas. And he is like moving up the list of Italian drivers' race wins in Formula One, which really goes to show you that Italian driver success is a very interesting spectrum, but it's Kimi is breaking some new, fun, exciting records that Max Verstappen as a Dutch driver can't break. So that's something to keep an eye on. And of course, the biggest excitement from the beginning of the race was the wheel-to-wheel racing between Kimi and George. And I'm sitting here like, A, this is really, really fun. B, how long is it going to last? And C, are George and Kimi going to do what Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg did in Spain 2016 and just take each other out? Which fortunately they didn't do from a crashes or bad standpoint, obviously. And we'll talk a little bit more about George, but obviously George didn't finish the race. And so that we kind of lost that. But that was some of the best, cleanest wheel-to-wheel action that we have seen in a long time, especially between teammates. It's one thing for it to be like Max versus Lando, because we've had some really exciting Max v Lando clashes, some exciting Lewis Hamilton, Max Verstappen clashes. But when it comes to teammates, in this case, it was very exciting. And it was funny on the broadcast. They're telling the drivers on the radio that they're under investigation, but I don't think they are, which they actually were for leaving the track and gaining an advantage, which was very quickly dealt with. But I was like, wait a minute, I'm pretty sure they were, but it also would have been really funny, especially because it was getting a little touchy, for Toto to have been like, Bono, tell Kimi we're under investigation, so they both calm down, which Toto and Bono both know full well what happens when teammates can really get into it with each other. And you have the 2016 Spanish Grand Prix, which was 10 years ago as of a couple of weeks ago, and of course led to Max Verstappen's first win. But, TBT. Anyway, Speaking of Lewis Hamilton, this was his first ever P2 in Montreal. And I watched some of the post race interviews, and he's like, this is the most fun I've had in years. Which, if you think about the end of his time at Mercedes, like, he loved Mercedes, but the car did not love him back. And the car did not love him back last year at Ferrari, but it looks like he's finally getting more comfortable with the Ferrari, and Ferrari really wasn't. Ferrari didn't let themselves get in their own way in this one specific race. I don't think we're safe from this forever. But Lewis had a great time racing today. He looked really good. This is some of the best racing we've seen from him in a Grand Prix. Obviously, he's won a sprint race at Ferrari, but this is really exciting for him. As a not so Lewis Hamilton fan, would I have preferred him to stay in P3? Obviously, but of course it was still a good finish for him. And also, very interestingly, his first ever P2 in Montreal, which of his other 10 podiums, he either won the race or finished P3. And like I said, signs of life at Ferrari, and so we'll hope that this continues. And we did see some really good racing between him and Max. And to speak to Max, it was his first podium of 2026, finally. Thank goodness, because I was getting a little stressed out there. And the Red Bull looks better than it did at the beginning of the season. It doesn't look great, and obviously the McLaren of it all, and we'll get to McLaren in a few minutes, that gave two less cars that Max was going to have to fight through, because the Red Bull right now really does look like the fourth best car on the grid behind, let's say, the Mercedes, the Ferrari, and the McLaren in that order. So that was really good. This was also the first podium for the brand new Red Bull Ford powertrains engine that they have in the car, which, remembering, like, yes, we have such sky high expectations for Red Bull. Obviously, I'm wearing a Red Bull t-shirt, but this is still a brand new power unit in that car that has never driven in Formula One before. And Ford has not been in Formula One for a long time. So are we exceeding some expectations? Yeah. Does Red Bull still have a lot of work to do? Obviously. But as a Red Bull Max fan, this was great. And of course, it was also the first podium for the DM01, which is the name of the car itself, named for Dietrich Mateschitz, who was the Red Bull founder who had passed away a couple of years ago. So it was a solid day for Red Bull overall, even though, and moving on to who else impressed, Isack Hadjar was not necessarily the most thrilled with his day, but still, a P3 for Max and a P5 for the other Red Bull car is some of the best dual seat performance we have had from Red Bull since early 2024. And I might be wrong about this. I did look. I'm pretty sure this was the best finish for the second Red Bull seat since Miami of 2024, when Perez finished P4 alongside a Max Verstappen P2. That was a long time ago. That was like right before Perez started to slump. And the race before that in China was a Red Bull 1-3, I believe. So that was the last time that Red Bulls had a double podium. And I'm not thinking that we're close to seeing Red Bull double podiums this season, but this was a really good sign for the second Red Bull seat, especially considering everyone else who's driven in the second Red Bull seat, including Liam Lawson and Yuki Tsunoda and Sergio Perez after the 2024 Miami Grand Prix, when he just completely fell off. So this is really good. And also, Isack Hadjar was able to maintain his P5 finish, sitting 30 plus seconds of penalties, which we don't love to see a driver get penalties. But fortunately, it really didn't hurt him all that much at all, because he stayed ahead of Franco Colapinto the entire race. And to speak of Franco Colapinto, he has, for the second race in a row, he has beaten his best race finish. He was P7 in Miami and P6 here in Canada. So what does that mean? Of P5 in Monaco? We'll talk about Monaco in a couple of weeks. But Franco Colapinto, the Alpine looks... This is like a night and day Alpine from the Alpine of 2025, which, when you think about it, now that they're a Mercedes customer team, like, tells you how bad the Renault engines were, which we all know that the Renault engines were really bad, but hey. And he has also been on a little bit of a tear compared to Pierre Gasly, who has not been having the best time of things. So that's just something to keep an eye on between these two drivers, especially since Pierre Gasly has spent, since he arrived at Alpine, spends that time being Flavio Briatore's golden boy. So just I don't think that Fabio Briatore is going to be throwing the hammer down on Gasly like he would a younger driver like Colapinto or poor Jack Doohan, who is still hanging out at Haas as their reserve driver. But it's just something to keep an eye on. Though that said, Alpine does love this upward trajectory that they're on, I'm sure. And speaking of Haas, Ollie Bearman, Haas did not have a great weekend, which is interesting considering they did bring upgrades, but recovered from a terrible qualifying. He started P16 and managed to avoid all of the chaos and carnage and finished in the points in P10. So it was a little bit of a could have been worse situation for Haas, but Ollie Bearman is still showing that he's better than Esteban Ocon. And, after the whole segment that I did about Esteban Ocon and who's going to replace him and when he's going to be replaced, of course, now they spent the entire week talking about how, there's no bad blood between him and Ayo Komatsu and everything is fine. His seat is secure, which I do, like I said, I do think his seat is secure for 2026. For 2027, is there going to be someone available who can do better than Esteban Ocon or has a better ceiling compared to what Esteban Ocon has done so far, which once again, Esteban Ocon has not had a great Grand Prix race. So just things to think about. Moving on to who disappointed, which is really a lot more of what disappointed for the most part. We have to start off with from the beginning of the race, which in case you missed it, we had two more formation laps because of Arvid Lindblad's car. And that kid just cannot catch a break. If he is sniffing any moment of good, being up in the points, doing well, his car says, wait a minute, stop that. You can't be doing this good this soon in your career. And then the car will just break and just stop. So his car stalled on the grid. He couldn't get it into gear. He couldn't get off the line. And so we had a formation lap go around. And then we had another formation lap go around. And at one point I was waiting for the lights to go out and Kimi started inching off. And I yelled at the screen. It was like, Kimi, no. And then it was just because there was another formation lap again. And I think there was also a computer glitch issue that caused that second one because I think they had to reset something after the Lindblad formation lap, the Lindblad induced formation lap, you know what I mean? But yeah, that was a very chaotic start to the race. And then, of course, I'm going to talk about the McLarens in a minute. But first, we also have to go to the other what that disappointed, which, of course, is George's power unit. Because like I said at the beginning of the episode talking about Kimi, George was looking really good. He had been having a great weekend all weekend. He got sprint pole. He won the sprint. He got pole. And then all of a sudden, he also had a very bad start to the race, which continues to be a concern with Mercedes itself, is why is Mercedes still so bad trying to get off the line? What's it gonna take to fix that? And then of course it's the question of driver induced, because we've seen a lot of that with Kimi versus car induced. But George was doing great. He was fighting off Kimi. It was probably going to go down to the end of the race unless Max and Lewis in their cars got themselves into the mix, because that fighting would have stopped them from getting such a significant lead. And then George's battery just decided to say, no, thank you, I'm done. And that ended his 38 race finishing streak that dated back to Silverstone 2024. Fortunately for George, it was a better weekend compared to Miami. And when they were interviewing him in the media pen, that he was satisfied with how things went this weekend. So it was a good headspace for George to be in now, especially with all of this, Kimi Antonelli, championship leader. George is, of course, out of P1 by 43 points, which is a lot of points to be behind, though we have a lot of races to go. And Max's recovery attempt in last year's championship to try to get Lando, that shows that you can be out over 100 points and still bring a fight to the championship and bring a fight to the title. So by no means has Kimi managed to clear George far enough, clear anyone far enough, especially when we have a Kimi Antonelli who had a great start to his rookie season. And then we went to Europe where we thought that he was going to tear it up because he's been driving those European tracks almost his entire career outside of the F1 series, and he just couldn't do anything until they got out of Europe. So it is going to be a really interesting European season to see how Kimi is going to recover from the 2025 European season, but also to see how George is going to do. So we have some... The championship has not been settled, as we clearly saw from last season where it went down to Abu Dhabi. We still don't know yet, and even Toto himself thinks that it's going to go down to the wire. So we'll see. But speaking to McLaren, what were they thinking? That was a Ferrari tire strategy move right there, if I have ever seen one. And I get it that the weather was not great. I will say, before we get into the rest of the McLaren of it all, I said in the race predictions that compared to what I saw of the weather report and what F1 saw of the weather report, I didn't think it was going to be a wet weather race. And guess what? It was not a wet weather race. It rained in the morning. It barely even rained during the F1 Academy race, which we'll talk about the F1 Academy tomorrow. But it did not rain all of that much. It like sprinkled at the beginning of the race, and that was it. And when you think about how much information these teams have access to, especially weather forecast information, you would think that McLaren would have made a different, possibly better decision. And now, yes, of course, Lando's decision... It was not Lando's decision. McLaren's decision to put Lando and Oscar on inters did give Lando the lead of the race for a lap and a half before they realized that that was a terrible idea and those inters were not going to last at all. So the fact that they dove off pretty quickly for those was not a surprise. And it really just got worse from there. Lando had a power unit failure that sent him off, and he drove straight into that runoff area. He didn't want to give anyone a helpful safety car, which was a very interesting decision. And then, of course, Oscar Piastri was having a nightmare of a day. He hit Alex Albon. He got a penalty. I think he has another penalty at this point. I don't know. But like McLarens were just, you don't see McLarens getting lapped very often, and especially when the McLarens are the reigning Constructors' Championships. So they're probably going to have a very spicy debrief concerning their interpretation of the weather, shall we call it. Toto was asked about it after the race, and he's like, I believe heavily in karma, so I'm not going to say anything mean about it. And he's just like, I'm sitting here dancing on the inside. But he had said that Mercedes made the decision to go on slicks when it was raining very badly that morning, and that was the decision that they had made. And clearly it was the right one, because everyone who was on inters got off of the inters as soon as humanly possible, because that was not the right call. And sometimes you gamble and you get it. Here is where you gamble and you definitely did not get it. But it also goes back to like the weather reporting. Like, they had to have known it was not going to rain. It didn't rain at all. They said, oh, it might rain later. It didn't rain later at all. And my weather app is more accurate than that. So anyway, someone at McLaren's getting demoted, I think. And speaking of being hit while they're down, Alex Albon had a really rough weekend. And, last year it was Lewis Hamilton during the Grand Prix who hit a groundhog. And this year it was Alex Albon who hit a marmot in practice. And I really don't want this to be an annual thing. That's very unfortunate. And it was so interesting during practice where they're like, we have reports that there might have been an animal involved, so we're not showing you the crash footage. And I'm like, oh boy, because they'll show you a lot of things, but apparently they will not show you on the broadcast if your driver is hitting a groundhog. So unless you are actually watching Albon's onboard live, probably not going to see that footage. And he was in the back of the pack in the sprint. He DNF'd in the Grand Prix because, Oscar hit him. So really rough weekend for that side of the Williams garage. And of course, the obligatory disappointment of Aston Martin, to the surprise of no one, Fernando's seat apparently was having issues all weekend, which is his seat not installed into the car correctly? Like, that should... anyway, but he actually looked pretty decent this weekend. Like, he has been able to show that the Aston Martin does at moments have pace. Is this pace consistent at all? No. But it is there. It is there. They are close to figuring it. I don't know if they're close to figuring out, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel that they can reach, that they should be able to reach as a Formula One team. I was in the car the other day and I saw this beautiful black and white Aston Martin on the streets on the streets of Scottsdale. And I was like, oh, this car is so beautiful. It is so unfortunate that this brand is being represented on an international level by this Aston Martin tractor that we're dealing with. And speaking of tractors, Lance Stroll in his home race finished the Canadian Grand Prix 4 laps down. Him and Bottas had been overtaken by the race leader 4 times. That is a lot, and that is bad. But also it's Lance Stroll. What do you expect? You know, at least Bottas has the justification that he's in a brand new car on a brand new team, which I will say that I did see some like signs of life out of Sergio Perez all weekend long. He had moments where he looked good, even in the sprint race. It's just, you know, he got himself a penalty, and then the suspension of his car just decided to pop off in the middle of the race. So there are moments of progress, I believe, being made at Cadillac. I think they've brought their first set of upgrades, but they have a long way to go. Fortunately, I believe that they have the drivers to do it in Perez and Bottas. At this point, I think more Perez than Bottas, which could be interesting. But yeah, they're not there yet, our dear friends at Cadillac. Now, moving on to my predictions for the Canadian Grand Prix. Guess what? They were bad, though I was not as terrible as I thought on the Grand Prix podium. So, sprint pole, I went with Oscar Piastri. It was not Oscar Piastri, it was George Russell. And the podium, I went for an Oscar, Kimi, Max podium. It was George, Lando, and Kimi. So, oops. The P8 I picked Bearman. It was Arvid Lindblad. That was his moment of success during the weekend before his car said, I don't want to race in the Grand Prix. Sorry. For the Grand Prix, I picked Kimi. It was George. The podium that I picked was Kimi, Max, George. I picked the winner. I did pick the winner. Yay me. I picked Kimi. And then, of course, Max, I had P2. He finished P3, though he was riding in P2 contention for a while. And then instead of Lewis, I had George. And Lewis, of course, was P2. For P10, I picked Carlos Sainz, which I was actually not that far off for once. He was in P9. And, of course, it was Bearman, who I picked for P8 in the sprint. So, really, I'm so good at making race predictions. Do you want to make race predictions with me? Send them before Monaco. Now, biggest surprise, I picked that there were going to be no groundhog versus F1 car incidents, but of course there was in the one and only practice session. Sorry, Alex Albon. Of course, the biggest animal lover on the grid is the one who hits a marmot. Yikes. Or the marmot kind of ran into his car from the pictures I've seen. It's so unfortunate. And the dump of the weekend, I picked Esteban Ocon, who, to be fair, did not have a great weekend and lost to Ollie Bearman again. So I feel like I'm going to give myself points for dumb of the weekend. Now, final thoughts. The rating final thought, other than this was one of the most exciting races I've seen in a while, is I watched so much sports today. I watched 3 softball games. I watched a baseball game. I watched 1/4 of the NCAA Women's Lacrosse Championships. I am watching a hockey game as I record this. I watched an F1 race. That is so much sports. And of course, the Indy 500 happened today. I did not watch the Indy 500, but it was on television. So lots of sports, lots of good sports other than one sporting game that I wanted one team to win and they did not win, which is unfortunate. But anyway, these things happen. And I also watched the F1 Academy feature race, which we will do our full F1 Academy reaction. That will be out tomorrow. Really quick before we wrap up, the F2 experiment for Colton Herta, really interesting. He finished P7 in the feature race, which got him some points, P9 in the sprint, which did not. So he's currently P12 in the championship. So at the very least, we know that having an IndyCar driver come across to Formula 2, at least this IndyCar driver, is not running away with the championship immediately, but it's still something to keep an eye on. Anyway, like I said, coming up next, the F1 Academy Canadian Grand Prix reaction will be out tomorrow. So don't forget to tune into that, like and subscribe so you get all the notifications, etc. And then, of course, coming up next for Formula One, we are going to Monaco in 2 weeks. So we will have our Monaco predictions out closer to that. We'll also be moving to our new summer studio, which will be in a new third room building, because I'm pretty sure I'm not staying in the same room that I was in last year. So we will have a new backdrop. It will not be as exciting as this one. So we will say goodbye to the Kimi Antonelli poster. We actually might, I think we're going to see the Kimi Antonelli poster for the Monaco predictions. I think we're going to do that. I think I'm going to record that before I leave town. We'll see. But anyway, thanks for going off track with me, and I will see you in the next episode.